going, I will. Okie dokie. Now, here we are, and one of these days we're going to get music. I should have like kind of sound points and music stuff. One of these days will be more fancy, but here we are at the exciting world of Evolution Hour. And there's the wonderful little opening logo that Peter came up with, my Troubles in Paradise methodology of creationism. Note the website, tortucan.wordpress.com. If you don't have it on speed access on your computer or iPhone, what the hell are you doing wrong? Okay, we'll stop sharing here and get rid of that and put my ugly mug up to say Jackson is here today, and we're going to have an interesting chat, I think, about the whole notion of deep time. In other words, all the things that relates not merely to deep time for the Earth, but deep time for the universe, which we know is 13.8 billion years old for the universe, or 13.7, depending upon how anal retentive you want to be, and 4.5 billion years for the age of the Earth, about 4 billion-ish for life on Earth, hundreds of millions of years for the development of vertebrates, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of benchmarks on that. And I thought about, but people might think this was something that you only get at by reading science-y stuff or listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson Star Talks or something like that. But no, this is all around us, and all we have to do is take a look at it. Everybody on Earth has experienced deep time and has done time travel. And they do it every time they look at the sky at night. Because when you look at the moon, you're looking at something as it was a second and a half ago. And the sun that went down, you're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago. And if you see Mars up in the sky, you're seeing as it was, what, 6, 7, 8 light minutes ago. And if you look at Polaris, the pole star up in the Big Dipper, which every one of us as kids has done, oh, I can spot that. You have to be dull as a sack of hammers not to spot the Big Dipper. You're looking back in time 400 years. Louis XIV had just died when that light left Polaris. That's deep time. And if you have a chance to see the Andromeda Nebula, you're looking back in time 2 million years. Homo erectus was the big kid on the block in the hominids when that light left Andromeda. Everybody is seeing a deep time. They're encountering deep time the moment you do astronomy. And it's been that way for all the way along the road. And then we can go even farther back. What the most interesting bit I discovered is if you're old enough to remember old pre-high definition television sets, where you would have a channel, or when the channel went in the old days before 24-hour television channels would go off the air at night, and or if you tuned to a channel that wasn't broadcasting, there was all this white static. Some of that hiss is the static left over from the cosmic background radiation from the Big Bang. So technically speaking, everybody who ever saw that background hiss on your old NTSC style television set, a radio astronomy experiment observing aspects of the Big Bang, which I think is just a mind-blowing element. Now, remember too, we're made of sloshy water. Most of our bodies are water. We're just in a very skinny bag that kind of holds it. And we got gut microbia that have more cells in us than we do. But all the hydrogen in the water is formed in the Big Bang. So most of your body has atoms in it that date back 13.8 billion years. We're a walking monument to deep time and being made out of stardust. So that was another aspect of deep time that you can't get away from. And then the next topic I began to think about the geology aspect. And I had mentioned in several contexts, including in Slam Dunk, I think I may have mentioned the fact that the limestone that's used to build the pyramids has a whole bunch of foraminifera fossils in them. And it's laid down in the ancient seabeds that were there millions of years earlier, and eventually ends up at the limestone that's used to build the pyramids. So you can actually see some of the fossils, if you look in a microscope, in the stuff that builds the pyramids. So anybody that looks at those sorts of things is bumping into deep time. And that brought up the idea that in the geological context, it's all the stuff that we see in relation to the geology under our own feet. That I live in Spokane, Washington, and so I'm sitting on top of the Columbia basalt, which was a bunch of different mammoth volcanic eruptions that spewed out over many millions of years, I think about 10, 15 million years ago. and they can date all the different subcomponents. And then about in the 10, 11, 12, 13,000 year frame, during the ice ages, there were periodic ice dams upstream at Lake Missoula that would break up and send catastrophic floods down through the Snake River, or not Snake River, but the Coeur d'Alene and Spokane, down into slosh over into what is still Lake Coeur d'Alene and what used to be Lake Columbia, where I'm sitting. I would have been under a couple hundred feet of water here in Spokane. And that occurred again and again and again, eroding away the topsoil, carving these narrow, steep canyons with sheer walled sides, the Grand Coulees and all of that, laying big, giant ripple marks of debris that got laid in that you can see from the air. And so I'm particularly attuned to that. But every place on Earth has a history. The reason why the rocks are the way they are, the reason why the fauna and flora are the way they are, is all due to the geological background of millions of years of changing going on and evolving going on, and then human beings coming in and bringing all of their stuff and starting to grow rhododendrons and azaleas where they weren't native, and bringing their cows and animals with them and so forth and so on. So everything has a tracer. Some of them are very complex. The Alps were very complicated to work out geologically because that's a plate collision, and boom, the African plate slams into Europe. Technically speaking, most of Italy is Africa, if you look at it geologically, and it pushes up the Himalayas. In fact, or the Alps. In fact, every big mountain range virtually is formed in a plate collision. So the reason why the Himalayas are as big as they are is because they're a relatively recent collision. The reason why the Alps are not quite as tall is because they're a little bit older and have had a lot of erosion and glaciation going on. The reason why the Appalachians look dumpy and boring by comparison to the Rockies is they're 300 million years old and they've eroded, but they used to be as big as the Himalayas back 300 million years ago. So Jackson, you are a geology buff. And so maybe you could put a little input on this about how your own understanding of your area down in Louisiana and the various other places that you visited, you connect up with deep time that way.
Well, Louisiana is entirely Cenozoic rock. The bottom southern eastern part of Louisiana is the youngest rock, which is Pleistocene. There are lots of Pleistocene deposits down here. And the northwesternmost part, which is where I live, that's Miocene to Oligocene area, but it's all very young here. There's actually at the museum fossils. They have a big mastodon that they recovered from one of the Pleistocene sites around here. They're also taking archaeology this semester. There are lots of really neat archaeological excavation sites out here in Louisiana because there are several different Native American tribes down here, and that go back pretty far. They go back pretty far in time.
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, the amount of knowledge that we have accumulated in just the last 10 or 15 years on all the Native American peoples and their archaeology has just exploded spectacularly. I barely scratched the surface of that. I had the delight of finally visiting the Anasazi ruins in New Mexico a few years back with my niece when we were going back to Louisiana to visit my sister. And on our way back, I routed us through there because it's really hard to get to. It's out in the middle of nowhere and it's very rough roads and that. So you have to really work at doing it because you got to stay 50 miles away from where the thing is and then drive in. But once you get past that, boy, it is spectacular to see that. It's one of the great fossil sites. And in Hopewell, in Ohio, the big mound builder cultures, there's more and more evidence to show a big trading network with Central America to where the ball game that the Maya played that continued on into the Aztecs, that apparently was a kind of a sport that spread in its own way the way soccer did in our modern world. So you had people playing ball games up in these cultures in North America that are distant remnants, and the various step pyramid monuments that they were building on a much smaller scale, but they're imitating the cultural tropes that they're getting from their cousins way down in Central America. So there's a whole bunch that we now know today that has been just absolutely wondrous about it. Big chunks of what we have here in Spokane is relatively recent in the same way, but we've got little bits and pieces down in the basement. That's why if you're a dinosaur paleontologist, some of the states are boring because there's no dinosaurs, because they're not old enough to have Mesozoic deposits in them. You got to go farther west into areas that had the right deposits. So we've got Washington ain't a good state for a lot of that stuff. You can find a few sparse examples here and there, but it's very, very little. But you go up into Montana and Wyoming, and now you're on the edge of that old Niobrara Seaway, and you've got tons of deposits, and it goes up into Alberta and that. And so that's where the dinosaur diggers are, and to some extent a little bit down in Texas and some of the other areas there. But then you can start building up the biogeography and stuff. So in every place on Earth has got a window on the past. And I know there's, I think, Chronix guides. I'm just going off memory here, but you typically, if you go into your local bookstore, you can look in the geology section or science section, and you'll probably find some guides to the geology of your local area. Roadside guides, I think they're called, where you can go on driving tours and spot all the geology of your area, and they have all of the stuff on the fossils and the archaeological data and all that. Yeah, and they're just delightful. They are just neat.
I went on the trip west just recently. We went all the way to the Grand Canyon, and we were in New Mexico, and there's this they're what called the Petrified Forest, which was really neat because it was this Triassic stratas. It was basically cusp of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were just barely.
Yeah, they're coming in very late here. Triassic.
Yeah,
but you do theoretically get the almost dinosaurs, and so the dinosaur formes, that bunch of nearly dinosaurs, had a quite broad range. The kind of teeter-totter critter, where you have a balancing a pelvic bone and a relatively long neck and a relatively long balancing tail. That basic theropod layout is kind of what early dinosaurs and the almost dinosaurs look like. So it's like there's a selection pressure for bipedality. There's a selection pressure that it's only occurring in that cluster because the mammals have gotten, by that time, the mammals are just developing. It's at the tail end of the reptile-mammal transition. So they are basically committed to quadrupedal. And it's relatively rare for them to adapt into bipedal. Jump in there.
I was just saying, we saw they had some Dicynodonts, and I posted one of the pictures I took. I was standing with the Dicynodont cast, and I said, just two therapsids. Trying to be funny, but those were the casts. They said the real fossils they dug up they'd send over to Berkeley, and that's where those were. Yeah. But it was
I think Kevin Padian and that bunch at the University of California.
Yeah, it was very interesting because they had some gigantic crocodilomorphs. They even had some very unusual archosaurs that were semi-aquatic, like this guy called Van Clevia, who was a strange one.
As many paleontologists are. I mean, think Robert Backer.
Yeah, Van Clevia. Let's see. I'll type that. Van Clevia. There you go. So he was this semi-aquatic animal, basal to, or he was less derived than Euparkeria, they said, but more derived than I think the Erythroseuchids, if I remember correctly, something like that. So it was very all those kind of stem archosaur guys.
Yeah, the more we see the shrub model working out, that there's never a case where there's like a beeline that just one little lineage is doing its little trick all in complete isolation. It's part of a broader group, and there's the reason why the group that ended up being so successful is because it was hitchhiking off of selection pressures that were playing a role in lots of different parallel tracks. And so this was something that was a common mutation that was developing in many ways, and usefully adaptive in their various contexts, but one or other groups go in there. Brian Stevens in the live chat pointed out he was going to take some neighborhood kids up to Okefenokee to fossil hunt, but the cost up there is $60 per adult and $45 for kids, 5 for under 3. The guy's running a racket. Yeah, you're probably right on that one. I never had a chance because I didn't stay long enough on the visit I did to Drumheller up in the Royal Tyrrell Museum up in Alberta. quite a few years ago, but they have things where you can go on digs, and I think it's free. You just have to get reservations because there's a limited amount of thing, but they still do active paleontology there, and visitors can actually be involved in that. That's another place that, for one of the great museums of the world, it's also out in the middle of nowhere because it's in the middle of an actual archaeological field, and it's literally nothing out there. I think it's like 50, 60 miles away from Edmonton. Up there in Alberta, so you've got to haul ass to get there from the States, but it's well worth it because they have a fabulous museum. It's got a broad range. First time I ever saw a Camarasaurus, which is the critter whose head was the head of Brontosaurus, and I'd always wanted to be able to see one full scale to be able to have a sense about what it was, and later on I finally got a little dinosaur model of it. But yeah, there's so many of these little areas that place two major museums that have fossil dig aspects to them, like University of California or the Carnegie in Pittsburgh or American Museum of Natural History. They probably have outreaches for schools and contexts where they can interact, and maybe even you can book a lecture or whatever in your local area or bring them into your college and that. So that's something to consider too, to connect up with people to see how it's done and ask more about the people who do it for a living, that can clarify and illuminate how exciting that kind of science work is.
Yeah, it's something I would like to do in the future. We when we got to meet Julia Clark, she told us about research paleontology she had done in Antarctica, where they found this this goose-like bird named which they named Vagavus, which was pretty cool. But yeah, I also think it's really interesting.
That was just brand new cutting work. I think they just did the paper on that, wasn't it? That curious aquatic bird-like dinosaur.
No, that's Halscaraptor.
Oh, that's a different one. Okay, well there we go. You can get even more data.
Vagavus is like a let's see, I'll put it in the chat. There you go. It's like a kind of goose, I think, some kind of anseriform, if I remember correctly. But I also think it's interesting that in the Badlands up in Montana, in that area, they're still finding new dinosaurs. Just like 2 or 3 years ago, I think they found a Spiclipius, which was a ceratopsian.
Oh,
I remember correctly.
A serious paleontologist thinks that we have all of the taxa. There's something like 20 main families involved, and the last time I looked, there was something like 500 genera. But at bare minimum, you're missing 50%, maybe more, of the major bunches knocking around. And so they find new examples. Now, of course, the main thing you want to have is beyond just a little fragment. If you find a new, slightly modified theropod tooth that's the most likely to be preserved, you know that there's a different species or maybe even a different genera involved. But you need to have more of the animal to find out what's going on. So when you dig up these larger cases where you've got more bits and pieces to look at, to where you can start finding out how the pelvic structure and what particular derived forms are involved, that's when things get really exciting, because that's another blip on the scope of the missing animal diversity that's probably there that you can't tell because you're based on the luck of the draw.
Well, you also have to be careful because you'll look at things like the pachycephalus, the pedomorphic pachycephalosaurs, which turn out to all be the same species. They're like Dracorex is like a small pachycephalosaur.
For those of us in the audience that do not necessarily recognize the technical terms that were just dangled about, pedomorphosis is where juvenile characteristics are retained into adulthood. And the idea, and neoteny is another term in that relates to that. And the idea that something that you might be thinking are separate animals are in fact growth stages of the same animal. So those things become really tricky to deal with, and you need more data on that. And so it's inevitable that individual examples are going to pop up, especially when animals develop ornamentation as adults, as sexual display that they don't need as a little baby running around the nest. Steve Bauman asks in there, I doubt we will ever find mountain dinosaurs. That's an interesting thing. And I can't recall offhand whether there are any dinosaurs that look like they had a mountain living context that would be the counterpart of a mountain goat. But then again, how easy would it be to have those preserved? Typically, you find that stuff that's preserved is stuff that's washed into areas downstream down the river. So the idea that stuff may have a mountain habitat, but the chances of that being preserved are relatively low. So it may just be a selection error from the fact that it's the least likely places. You're not going to have spots to preserve those sorts of things. You might be able to infer the presence of things by knowing flora and fauna shifts. So, for example, follow the herbivores. If you have a particular kind of plant that is typically eaten by a particular herbivore, and you know the herbivores exist, and you know the range of those, is it unlikely that some predator is not going to be adapting to hunt them? And so that's another one that'll be kind of an interesting question. But right offhand, yeah, Steve's raised a really interesting point, is that were there any dinosaurs that lived in mountains? We know dinosaurs had a full range over the planet. So they lived all the way into the Arctic regions on both poles. And of course, Antarctica was down at the pole at that time. It was nippy, but not as frigid as it is now. And so they clearly were able to adapt to a variety of circumstances. Presumably, feathered theropods and others would have an easier way of handling it than non. But the one area, in addition to mountains, that I've always been fascinated with is the absence, at least so far, of fully aquatic dinosaurs. All of the marine reptiles that existed are not on the dinosaur lineage. The mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and all that bunch had developed way before the dinosaurs in the Triassic, and had basically staked out the niche pretty much. And so dinosaurs probably would have had difficulty getting into those environments. And it's no coincidence didn't get into the field as the cetaceans until after the mass extinction. And it got rid of all of those marine reptiles so that they had a ton of fish to eat there in the Ichthys Sea that's beginning to break up as India is heading towards this subcontinent to slam up the Himalayas. And that's where the early whales developed. And then they spread all over the place. Basilosaurus very quickly develops. It's a long snake-like whale. If you look up that, I'll put that in the thing in here for Basilosaurus, I think.
Ooh, Archie, send them my new video, or my recent video on whales.
Oh! Well, you have the link to that probably way faster than I do. So go ahead and put that in. I think you're commanding. You can do that. I'll put a little note in here to indicate if you don't have a right to put in a link. I think I've given you power to do so.
I'll see if I let's see. I gotta go back.
I'm looking at my little.
Oh, but yeah. So I made a video recently about about cetaceans.
Yes, whale sex. I learned quite a bit about that. In fact,
I think we all did.
I knew little aspects of it because you had brought it up because of creationism. That creationists have made a big deal about the vestigial pelvic bones of whales, and they're functional. They're used in sex and copulation. Well, who worked that out was regular evolutionists, and the idea that a vestigial system is unfunctional is not evolutionary. No, it's the example of.
It's not letting me put it in there.
Yeah, because I'm trying to call up the damn window here. That add moderator, bingo. Yeah, so you should have a right to be able to do. Oh, wrong. Yeah, okay, I'm on the wrong. God, annoying. Yeah. Wait a minute. It's every time I click around here, then I try to click on something in the window. There you go. You should be a moderator. You should be able to put the website up now.
Okay. All right. Let's.
The feedback as I move my mouse over the thing, it jumps ahead of me. So I think I'm at one spot when I click, but it's in fact somewhere else. The feedback is slow, just a tiny fraction of a second. So I'm suddenly doing the wrong thing.
Yeah,
and that's very annoying. I am an old person. I am from the past when they had rabbit ears on televisions. I am not used to some of these things.
Yeah, I had with the back to the whale, the creationists were talking about that. They all have websites on the legs aren't vestigial because because they're functional, which I really don't understand why creationists are so against vestigial organs. They could simply just say the fall caused it.
Yeah, look, they will eventually. Some of them will probably take that attitude because it's their default position they can deal with. But they basically find any way they can do. The trope that vestigial means functionless has been a long one. And it's been very difficult to wean creationists off of it because they're parasitical copyists. They rely on other people's arguments to tell them things. So they're stuck with them.
But you know what is very telling? I had to go to the second page of results, I think it was, before I found a creationist source that disagrees or that will actively say hippos are not closely related to whales. I had to go to the second page of creationist sources on that, which I found very telling.
Yeah, you have to get up to the upper level echelon of anti-evolutionists, and there are some. The answer is research journal types, and a little bit at the Discovery Institute gang, but they kind of shy away from an awful lot of this stuff too. I think Cornelius Hunter and a few others, and I think Casey Luskin shot his mouth off it occasionally. I'm just going off my memory here, so I may or may not be on the mark on that one. But we have to remember, in anti-evolutionism generally, they're really behind the data curve.
Oh yeah, the
because none of them are workers in the field. Yeah, they get stuck on that little thing. You know, that a thing that was kind of a debate back in the 1990s, which is settled now. They still think is a debate because they're stuck on the stuff their creationists mentioned back in the 1990s, and they can't get past it because they just don't bother to look. If any of them were paleontologists, which is very few of them are, and those don't really do much paleontology anymore because they just have no curiosity, they're never going to make the data fit. So what you end up with, all paleontological subjects are discussed by non-paleontologist interlopers. And that means that they're riffing off of the stuff they were riffing off. There are people riffing off of something else. So it's often a long trail to try to find out where they think they're talking about this, as opposed to just dealing with the current data set.
Exactly. But that's creationism for you.
Yeah, and they forget, they're so busy harping on the hind legs that they've forgotten the front legs. Because there's been an awful lot of research over the last 5-10 years on the genetics of the formation of flippers.
The developmental
when marine animals in general they all started out as pentadactyls because the 5, 6, 7, 8 fingered tetrapods back in the Devonian began to lose those things and kind of settle in on a pentadactyl mode. It was nicer on land. You have just enough fingers to get by and not too many to get in your way. And that became kind of the standard model, although dinosaurs just dropped digits like mad, all the way down to 2 in the case of tyrannosaurs. But mammals tend to be relatively consistent, and so too do a lot of other reptiles. So what happens is when an animal gets into the water, it's now advantageous to have more digits, more phalanges.
Hyperphalange.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. Well, you technical guy. And so when you find, in fact, there was one of these examples of, I think I alluded to it in Slam Dunk, an animal that was an instance of phalangeal variations that were popping up because when they went back into the sea, now there was a selection pressure for more stuff down in the hand. And that's exactly what happened with it. And you find that full blown in whales. So you've got, and they could start working out the genes, the developmental mechanisms that produce that. And there's actually quite a lot of technical literature on the evolution of cetacean flippers and how it develops in various forms and is mutated over time. And you eventually just get this mass of little bone bits in there that are formed. And the same thing happened with plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, or not with plesiosaurs, but ichthyosaurs. And it's interesting that it apparently has to do with how they steer, because if you look at your plesiosaurs, they're basically flyers underwater. Your classic Loch Ness Monster thing, they've got great big arms and legs with flippers on them, and they're basically swimming underwater with those. Whereas your ichthyosaurs and your whales are tail propellers, and your ichthyosaurs and the like, they swim this direction with the tail going sideways. Mammals do this way, and it's that pelvic vertebral shift that it's because they're built differently, and so they have a different anatomical history as land mammals that causes them to swim that way. Well, you need something to act as your steering mechanisms and guidance things. And so it's looking like you've got a selection pressure for real fine-tuned control up in the front flippers, which is not used for propulsion, they're used for steering. And anybody who's a super duper whale expert, and if I'm making a mistake on any of that stuff, let me know. We'll adjust our brains down accordingly. But that's my take on it so far.
You know, yeah, all the research I found, there was so much more research than what you would think there is if you were just reading creationist work.
Oh, yeah.
If you were just looking at... Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, if you look at creationist stuff, they're just talking about, like, oh, there are these bones. That's pretty much it. But then you look at how much data and how much data there actually is. There's even data on the potential copulatory mechanism of basilosaurid hind limbs. There's just
and that's been riffed off of by some of the people in the anti-evolution movement. The thing I was trying to was about to jump in on and had to let you go because I you know how much I like to talk, is that the short form is, if all you know about evolution is what you read in anti-evolution literature, you're not going to know much, because they leave most of it out. 90% of the data. And so all you're getting are little snippets and little tiptoes into the water that is just way behind the data curve. And often it's ridiculously far behind the data curve. It's just astonishing the amount of work that's been done in a lot of these areas that the anti-evolutionists don't bump into much. I've my shameless plug on Evolution Slam Dunk in the comment section, because that, of course, relates to the reptile mammal transition, where there's 100% failure rate. They completely miss all the data stream on there, literally. And in fact, I'll bring that up because I was wanting to mention that. That's another one of those deep time issues, because everybody's jaw and everybody's ear bones in the middle ear are the fossil remnants of 100 million year long process that took place before the dinosaurs even showed up. So when everybody goes and are hearing things on their live streaming of rock music, they are making use of the mechanisms that occurred in deep time, hundreds of millions of years ago, before the first dinosaur walked the earth. And that, to me, is kind of amazing.
In Doodle. It's pretty
We're
cool.
about halfway through the show, so let me go through my incredibly awkward process stuff to call attention to our Patreons here. So I got to go through the little rigmarole again. Watch RJ try to find the damn green button for screen sharing when it doesn't want to pop up easily. There we go. Share that. Boopity boop. Okay. Uppity bop. Alrighty. I want to thank everybody. Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Eric and new Benjamin Simpson and Staggles and Alex and Totes Real. I love saying that. And Paul, thank you all for being Patreon supporters of the project. It's awkward for actually getting any of that money because Patreon is weird, but nevertheless, I'm not going to discourage you. I will call attention to my WordPress website, where I've got linkages to all the stuff and all the different works that I put up already. That's free. All the PDFs there. Share them. It's free, open access information, book length material. All that stuff is there. Map of time. I've got that. Somebody, in fact, liked my map of time chart. And the fellow that helped me do it, he's been busy reconfiguring his computer business and that, so he's been having to get back to him on. But he wanted to have a T-shirt showing that. And so what I'm hoping to do eventually this year will be to do a T-shirt which will have a couple other layers. It will literally have the entire history of the universe from the Big Bang all the way down to our human lineage, all on a simple visual framework that you can wear and all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the little programs that we're kind of thinking about. And so there's the Patreon. And then for getting money way faster to support the project, the GoFundMe.com DC Go thing. That I literally get in like a couple days. So in the shameless plug department, that one has a much faster time on it. I will now stop sharing and we get to go from through to shameless talking. And So to recap, for anybody popping in the show, oh, Brian, well, we were talking about the whale issue. Brian Stevens pointed out bone bits are more flexible than long rods, too. And that's a relevant factor. You can find, too, these long, stiffening bones. Anybody who's into dinosaurs and sees dinosaur fossil data will probably spot hadrosaurs in particular, and other taxa as well, but definitely hadrosaurs with these enormously complex networks of stiffening rods in the tail. And the same thing goes for theropods. If you look at a Deinonychus, that's the velociraptor of the old Jurassic Park movie, and look at the actual fossil, there's stiffening tendons and rods in there to make the tail very, very stiff. And that obviously will have some adaptive, that's easy for me to say, adaptive characteristics to make the balancing aspect. Hadrosaurs are kind of interesting. There's still an interesting discussion about how quadrupedally they were, how prone they were to balancing on their hind legs and using their front limbs. And it looks like they were more ambipedal than some of those that were obligatory bipeds. Like your Enithymemosaurs and that crowd, and the theropods that got into that, or obligatory quadrupeds like the sauropods that got into that trick fairly early in their evolutionary lineage. And then you got the ones like the ceratopsids that start out as bipeds in the Psittacosaurids in Asia, and then turn into small quadrupedal forms in the protoceratopsids, and then big quadrupedal forms in North America, turning into triceratops. So there's a little bit on the dynamic taxonomy matter, but there, all of that stuff you can connect up with. Then, getting back to the theme of the show, with finding out about the geology of your own area. And also, it's useful in slamming creationists, because if you have a local creationist who's talking about the flood and you know the geology of how that stuff formed, you can ask them the killer question, gee, where's the flood layer here? And how did you determine that? And so that's a tripwire you can do for the people in your particular area. I call attention to it all the time on Twitter, where somebody will say about the flood, and they're bringing up the Grand Canyon and all that stuff, but they don't live in the Grand Canyon. And I go, excuse me, where's the flood layer where you live? Describe that to me. There's none here in Spokane. What, did the spigot turn off? And they just go mum, because it literally never thought to look to their own feet. Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and all the rest, Ken Ham doesn't seem to know anything about the geology underlying where his theme parks are built. They're in Kentucky. And Kent Hovind, whether he was down in Florida or now his little new Dino Land thing that he's trying to start up in Alabama, I don't think he pays attention to the geology of those either, let alone explaining it from a flood context, which I think is terribly ironic.
Well, if they could do it, then if they could actually pull it off, that would make it science, which it isn't. So.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be yeah. And what I pointed out in Dinomania, and those of you who haven't read that, why not? It's one of those little free things there at #tip. That Dinomania is on flood geology, and I pointed out how much they had like observational wanderlust. To go everywhere but their local neighborhood. And this is the opposite of the history of geology. Nicholas Steno, who was a devout Catholic priest back in 1500s, if memory serves me, he was the guy that came up with the notion that, looking at his own backyard, that if you got layers of rocks, like the stuff at the bottom must be formed before the stuff at the top. Duh. And so that notion of superimposition started developing, and that's a core aspect of modern geology. So what they were trying to do, the people that founded geology, and the ones Hutton and all the rest later on in the 18th century, these are people who were trying to explain their backyard, or the places they saw when they went up to the countryside, when they went up to Sicker Point there out in the middle of nowhere in Scotland, and goes, whoa, how the hell did this weird chevron of rocks form? Wait a minute, how long does it take to erode? How long does it take for sedimentary deposits to form and then tilt and then be eroded and have something else lay on top of it and then it form and then it gets eroded away and this whole thing gets tilted again? And how long does that take? Whoa, let's do the math. And even at the most conservative assumptions that they could see about how depositions were forming and eroding, that thing had to take more than 6,000 years to make. So that's how people developed their thing, by explaining their backyard and curiosity about what was under their feet. And that is notably absent among creationists. You get a little pretend aspect of it. Andrew Snelling likes to point out how where he comes from down in New Zealand and all that has all of these things that point to catastrophic events. But when you look up what he discusses about him, you discover he's riffing off of stuff that was like 100, 200 years old in cases, and he doesn't even pay attention to the current paleontology. And he's a geologist. So suddenly he's got the blinders on, and you can literally see him put the blinders on by what he doesn't discuss in his own writings on the subject.
Well, I looked at that with the oil case in my my video about the Genesis Paradise Lost, how they claimed all have the same data, and he's like, well, no, oil can form rapidly because look at this abiotic oil or abiogenic oil. This is exactly like the biogenic oil. Or I mean, he would the way he would frame it is he would just say oil. Like it's all oil. All oil is the same. Oil is oil is oil.
Oop, I'm sorry. I'm getting feedback from my fault here.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I was checking on something and I accidentally had the thing up where I was starting to get the feedback from the live feed, and that was bad dog. My fault. My bad.
That's okay. The way he frames it in his article is that like all oil is just oil. There are not different types of oil. It's all just oil. And so he wants you to believe that biogenic oil, which is formed by ancient marine organisms and whatnot, is the same as the abiogenic oil that you can make in a lab in a few weeks, whatever.
Yeah.
And then
oil
he's just like,
can be made catastrophically in a short period of time. They do it. Kent Hovind does exactly the same thing, although technically it's not his mistake, it's somebody else's mistake. When he's talking about, there's an example of this airplane, I think it was during World War II or a little bit later, some big bomber crashed up in Greenland, I think it was. And it slammed into the ice. And recently, last 10 or 15 years, they went back and located the damn thing. And it's like 50 feet in the ice. And so they had to excavate down to get to it because it's now considerably deep. So they're arguing, oh, see, ice forms very, very quickly, and therefore all of these ice age things could be generated in just a short amount of time. Look at this. The problem is not all ice looks the same. And the kinds of ice that's forming very, very quickly that way, and it allows a warm body like that to sink down into it and get covered over by the newer material, is very different structurally than the old ice that's formed over millions of years or thousands of years by compression. And so if you look at the stuff up at the top end of the glacier, the deep coring, the experts can instantly tell the difference between the different bubble formations and stuff of the quick forming recent stuff and the stuff that's been formed under very long compressions that they do when they do the ice cores and do things where they can find out what paleoclimate was. And I don't think for a moment Kent ever got close enough to the data field to know that that mistake was there. But whoever was making the original argument was presumably able to figure that out themselves and neglected to do so. Duh.
Yeah. I think Bill Nye brought that up during his debate with Ken Ham. He talked about the snow ice cycles and how
because
they have
of climate change.
That,
I make a point of probing, and the National Center for Science Education has done this too, that there is a overlap between climate change denialism and creationism. Because it's kind of a Venn, if you think about a Venn diagram where you have all climate change deniers, you're going to find this huge blob that occupies almost all of it. That's actually the creationist who is doubting that. And so it's part of this very culture camp conservative right-wing worldview that's been going on all the way since Jerry Falwell's day, where they were always anti-environmentalists and all the climate change and environmental issues. He was always digging his heels on that back in the 70s and 80s, which is a long time ago. But that has continued. Plus, you've got the parallel track of the business types, your Heartland Institute, which is an industry flack thing that's financed by oil interests. Yeah. And so while it's not the case that all climate skeptics are creationists, creationists will be climate skeptics. And so when I've been dealing with things, Dinesh D'Souza the little troll that we both despise so much for good reason. He shot his mouth off yet again on climate change on Twitter just a couple days ago. And
Of course he did.
again, I was probing him. Sources, please. Sources? Huh? Sources? And you could never get him to do it. But the people that jumped in would be showing that they didn't want, one guy was from the energy industry, like duh, and he was saying, no, there's none of this evidence for any of these things, and the hockey stick is completely wrong. And I go, sources on that, please? And I was actually putting up technical literature that was going into the context, and he never offered a damn source at all. And then he was getting, oh, I have to go to bed, I'm tired and all that, you know. But I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to explain at some unspecified later date why you're completely wrong, but I'm not going to be able to give you anything at the moment. I mean,
I'm too tired. I've been on Twitter for far too long today.
Yeah, they suddenly become so weary, and then they spend another half hour tweeting.
Well,
I love
that's
that part.
The world of
That's
the
hilarious.
internet for you.
Yeah. But anyway, so the thing that I would be doing on the climate change issue would be probing what sources they don't have, and then reminding poke Dinesh D'Souza. Here we're getting political. That base are a pile of creationists, and he doesn't want to think about that.
I think more now. I think conservatives in general, from what I've seen, are more accepting of climate change now. But I think a lot of them are saying, yes, but it's not anthropogenic. Yes, there's climate change, but humans have nothing to do with it. It's all natural cycles of the earth.
Even evangelicals. And not all evangelicals are anti-evolutionist, for example. Not all evangelicals are conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a broad range of dynamics going on in there. But in the upper echelon here would be somebody who's a liberal, pro-evolution climate, Freeman Dyson, the physicist. And he's sort of had a dilettante interest in this over years. And his argument finally, currently, the last time I looked from him, is that yes, climate change is real. And yes, it's human caused, because all you'll get are happy plants from all that extra carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
At which point your jaw drops. But nevertheless, sorry, it's not quite that. In fact, somebody, one of the culture campers I was jousting with maybe 3 or 4 months ago, was using that exact argument to where it's just, no, CO2 is just fine. It is no problem on things. I go, what about the oceans? Don't you know about the effect that carbon dioxide has on ocean acidification? And he went, no, I've never heard of that. Well, gee, you should keep up with the climate research. So I put a technical paper up that was a recent survey of that little very problem, and he suddenly shut up in a hurry. Went on and read the thing. I don't know, but nevertheless, that even without the temperature increase that's going to eventually have the waves lapping at Mar-a-Lago as Florida disappears in the sunset over the next 50, 60 years, you've got the fact that ocean acidification is killing off some of the phytoplankton food chain. And they've recently found oxygen drops in big chunks of ocean that, for anybody who knows how ecology works, is causing them to go, but how much of that's going to filter through to Dinesh D'Souza? Nothing, because he doesn't pay any attention to anybody who pays attention to any of that stuff. And that's why this stupid method issue about how people consult source data, how they evaluate material, how they rely on secondary sources or not, whether they do fact checking, this bites. This has actual concrete impact upon actual policy that's affecting people's real lives. And it's something you better pay attention to.
Just last summer, I think it was, people in California were all wondering why the heck so many tunicates, called pyrosomes, were turning up off California, because they don't go up that far. It's like, not only do they not go up that far, they were in massive numbers. They were all over the place. Just, the fishermen were just catching these things all over the place. And they were like, well, what sort of impact will this have on the surrounding life? Because that means the oceans are getting warmer. The ocean is getting warmer near California. Habitat. And
for those in the audience that don't know what a tunicate is, they're a cute little, what are they, the cephalochordates, or what are they?
They're urochordates.
You're a chordates.
Cephalochordates are the
Thank you, Mr.
ungulates.
Taxonomy. I defer. Anyway, they're little bag-like sessile organisms. Not as a slip remark. You keep this stuff in your head, boom, 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 way better than I can. You're excellent on that. I bow my hat that I don't have on at the moment to you on that, and I'm always marveling at how many of the taxa names and things you can just rattle off in a way that I can't. I have to write them all down. But anyway, tunicates are little bag-like sessile organisms that look like jelly things. They're transparent, and they go boom, boom, and they feed. And they start out though in a larval form that's a little protochordate thing. It's got a little kind of almost notochord thing on it. And so they're at the very basal thing of the split into the chordates. And my favorite line that I came up, oh gosh, I can't think of her name right off the bat, but she wrote a marvelous little book. And along the way, she was talking about the tunicates in relation to evolution. And he says the tunicates sit down and attach their adult form and they eat their own brain, like an associate professor getting tenure.
Oh yeah, that's right. Richard Dawkins quotes that in the Ancestor's Tale.
Yeah, it's an absolutely dualistic because they do. They don't have their brain gets devoured because they don't need it anymore, so the brain that's in their little larval form disappears, and there's my little brief moment on the tunicates. Jonathan Wells even makes that mistake of where he's trying to dismiss evolution so much, and his listing of the animal phyla that appear in the Cambrian, you can, if you look up or have Jonathan Wells's stupid Icons of Evolution book, it's in the notes to the chart, and I discuss it in 3 macroevolutionary episodes. I'll put that up in there, more things people could get. That's a free book there on my website. 3 macroevolutionary episodes. Download the damn PDF and read it. Anyway, I call attention to it there, where he actually lists in the chordates the tunicates, and that's implicitly accepting a pile of evolution right there. Those little tricks on somebody who looks at the footnotes, Jonathan.
Well, I mean, if you even call this group of animals, if you even use that term chordates, that's quite a lot of morphological and genetic development.
Exactly.
Already.
Yeah. And that's part of the problem. My favorite one I love to point out, and it's even gotten worse because they've recently found an ancestral transitional chelicerae, or is it chelicerae? I can't. You're the expert on the pronunciation. Is it chelicerae or chelicerate?
I've always said chelicerate.
Okay, well, that's probably that. So, because a lot of these words, literally, I had never heard. I've only read them. So I can always assume that I might be stumbling on especially the long syllables. Well, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, I can say because I've heard it.
About that kind of stuff, yeah, they say, don't make fun of people who mispronounce things because that means they read it somewhere.
And so there we go. So yeah, I'll correct my pronunciation. And plus, your tongue will get into modes to where even if I know how it's pronounced, I'll still say it the way I always have been saying it. Yeah. So the chelicerates, which are spiders and scorpions and horseshoe crabs, date back to the Cambrian. But those are not spiders, scorpions, and horseshoe crabs. Those are the evolutionary precursors of them. The chelicerates of the Cambrian don't even have the chelicerae yet. That's an evolved feature that came along later. The diagnostic of the phylum. These are ancestral forms they're seeing in the Cambrian. And I've never seen the evolution movement up to and including Steve Meyer ever really get to grips with what it is that's back there.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about chelicerates from that, or chelicerates that far back. There were the trilobitomorphs were just coming into being in like the Ediacaran, but
and partly the problem with them is that they're soft-bodied, and so how do you find a soft-bodied trilobite ancestor in context where nothing soft-bodied is getting preserved? But the reason why we know so much about trilobites and why they were known in Darwin's day is because they molt and they produce a shell. So the vast majority of them, they would just have bunches and bunches. They molted constantly, and those got preserved. So that's why they thought of the Cambrian as the age of trilobites, because that was the stuff that got preserved. We found later on, as they started to discover these Lagerstätten deposits and reevaluating the Burgess Shale starting in the 1970s, that there was a whole missing ecosystem there. Now got a little better look at, but even those are data selection points, because all of those Lagerstätten deposits, the Burgess Shale up in Canada and the Sirius Passage in Greenland and Xinjiang in China, are all equatorial at the time they were formed. Mm-hmm. So they're relatively deep water equatorial deposits that you don't know what's going on up in the North Pole. There's land masses other than just the breaking up Rhodinian supercontinent, and what was going on in the South Pole, what was going on in temperate areas, were there temperate areas? There's a whole pile of stuff that you can't be certain of because you don't have any Lagerstätten deposits.
Yeah, there's all those weird little guys like Dickinsonia and Charnia Discus, and which they think Dickinsonia is now like a stem metazoan, don't they?
Yeah, it's interesting. It looks, for those of you who don't know what it looks like, they about 3 feet long or so. At the time, it was a giant critter, or whatever it was, about the size of your bath mat. Was giant compared to almost everything else. It looks kind of like corrugated ripple thingies, shaped kind of like an oval. And I think it's Dickinsonia. There's evidence that it moves, that they found indication of trail things and certain contexts to suggest that it was not sessile, like the tunicates. And that meant it had muscles, and that meant that it's more of a metazoan, even though we don't have any Lagerstätten deposits. If we had Lagerstätten deposits of Dickinsonia, we'd be able to do CT scans of the material and see way more detail than you have currently, but we don't have that. Charnio Discus, I think that's kind of a thing that looks like a little palm frondy thing.
I think so. Oh, yeah. Those guys are weird.
I mentioned a lot of that in 3 macroevolutionary episodes with pictures. I mentioned a lot of that stuff in there, and that's freebie download. That way I didn't have to worry about the picture rights on anything because I'm not making any money on it. So it's free. And just make use of that. Oh, I think, in fact, there's a big debate. I think Brian is putting up some linkages, hopefully that's on the... I should probably put those in my little future links here to check out as well. I mean, it's frustrating when you bring up technical papers. I've got to look to find out if they're in my bibliography. Shame on you.
Well, RJ, you're going to have a whole lot to check out with my next video. Because I
put these on temporary tabs so that I can get back to them later. And then I can look into it. Yeah, it looks like some of those don't seem to be connecting up for me here. And that's a YouTube, so I don't want that. Anyway, so I make it the point that I want to always keep up with the technical literature. One of the things we do is vet his scripts for comments, and he's extremely accurate. I don't think I've found any boners in there ever. A few occasional phrase changes and maybe a couple newer papers and that. But what's marvelous is I almost invariably encounter technical literature that I didn't know about. Follow up on stuff on that, because then I want to integrate it into my data set. And then sometimes I'll find newer material relating to that stuff, like the serpentization stuff, that Jackson didn't know about. And so between the two of us, we're constantly learning more and discovering stuff. Ain't scholarship fun?
It is pretty great. I'm very glad to have someone who can read my scripts. The Abiogenesis Part 2 that I just put out had a whole lot of sources in it. I don't know if you've if you've checked all the sources out yet on that one, but yeah, that one had a whole lot of sources.
Oh, I literally do. Yeah, I go down through every bloody one of them to make sure that I've checked out the circumstances on it. Sometimes it's a lot of them already are in there, and I go, phew, isn't that nice? But I can then find out, it's usually on a topic that had slipped past the radar because they're a technical topic that you would know about if you're in the field more than what I'm getting at other levels, looking at it in terms of what's popped up on the AntiEvolution index. So that's the cutting edge some of the material that I deal with in building up TIP is that I'm looking at how anti-evolutionists are approaching the problem. And that won't tell you what they're missing. It'll only tell you what they think they're discussing. And so somebody that's writing in a more technical venue, the way you've been tending to do, is that you're hitting the stuff from the technical end, and a lot of that will never have popped up on their scope. So I'm encountering it because it's the science data, not stuff that's been riffed on by the anti-evolutionists 900 miles away.
Oh yeah, I cite a creationist article at the beginning of my next video, which I'll have the script for that done a little bit later tonight. But it's not even an attempt to evaluate the fossil data for the claim. It was just embarrassingly bad.
Oh yeah, and I bet you'll realize that it's exactly the same kind of sidestep that intelligent designers do on the reptile-mammal transition.
Yeah, it's just embarrassing.
Well, we're just about down to the end of the show here, and I'm queuing up my cute little logo that I'll put up as the share. As usual, always takes me a while to get to it. So theoretically, everyone should be seeing the cute little logo that Peter put up for my design. It's kind of a steampunk vibe to it, with, of course, the little atomic symbols that I said that he should put up. He had like asterisks at those spots. I go, no, can you put a little atomic nucleus kind of a thing in there? So it has a little bit of the flavor of science and steampunk, and a lot of layers to it. So I would like to thank Jackson for today's thing. I'll just do a general recap. We've got the point that deep time is everywhere. You can see it in your own body. You can see it when you look at the stars. You can see it when you look at the geology at your feet. Everything about you is the heritage of a zillion amount of processes all interacting over billions and billions of years. You can get a flavor of that too. Neil Shubin's book that he has written, and name suddenly escapes me. It only came out a couple years ago. No, it's after that.
The Universe Within?
Yeah, it's on the history of geology. It's beautifully written. It's easily accessible. It's got a bunch of stuff on the hidden role of women scientists over the years. All of it's just wonderful. I heartily recommend it, even though it's not my book. And if you love that book and you decide to buy it, buy my books too. So anyway, we'll be shutting down tonight. Thank you so much for